The hum of the cabin was almost soothing, a low mechanical lullaby masking the restless shuffle of boarding passengers. But for Julian Hart, it was a battlefield of glances. At 76, his world had narrowed to quiet routines and old pain. Yet this flight was supposed to be different, and he had planned it for months. Marked the day in ink on a faded kitchen calendar, saving every dollar to sit in seat 14C, an aisle with enough room to stretch the leg the war had mangled. He had been a Marine once, a staff sergeant who pulled bleeding friends out of Quezon when the air was thick with fire and screams. Now he was just a thin man in a worn blazer, traveling from the wind-bitten plains of Wyoming to Annapolis to watch his foster nephew, the only family who had stayed graduate from the Naval Academy. Everyone else had turned their backs on him long ago when he told the truth about who he loved. They had slammed doors and returned Christmas cards unopened. Eli had been the only one who didn't. This flight was his march toward redemption, the small moment he had fought for across decades of silence. He sat quietly, hands folded over his boarding pass, letting the thrum of the engine seep through the soles of his shoes. Then a shadow cut across the armrest. Kayla, a young flight attendant with a crisp bun and an efficient smile, leaned in. Her voice was firm, polite in the way that concealed judgment. "Sir, we need this row for a family traveling together. Could you move to 32B? Julian blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. He explained, softly, about his knee, about the surgery scars that still throbbed like ghost shrapnel, about the months of planning this seat. But her expression did not change. Passengers nearby began to watch, their eyes carrying that peculiar chill reserved for inconveniences. He felt them measuring him an old man alone, a name they would never know, just an obstacle in their smooth journey. Kayla's tone sharpened. "We can't close the doors until you move." Something inside him sagged. He did not argue. Marines don't plead. Slowly he rose, gripping the headrest as his legs screamed awake. The pain shot upward like a flare. The aisle blurred for a moment, then steadied beneath his boots. No one spoke. No one offered to help. Julian limped past the family sliding into his row, past the polished shoes and glowing phone screens, until he reached the back of the plane. Seat 32B waited like a punishment between two strangers who didn't glance up. He lowered himself carefully, folding the damaged leg in tight, feeling the joint lock. The air back here smelled of recycled coffee and forgotten people. He sat still, jaw tight, eyes on the seat back ahead, as if looking anywhere else might shatter him completely. None of them knew the truth, that this frail figure they had pushed aside had once crawled through gunfire to drag 6 brothers home from hell, that every scar under his pressed trousers was a map of courage. Somewhere deep inside, beyond the ache, he told himself this humiliation would not follow him. He was here for Eli. Nothing else mattered. If you believe dignity belongs to everyone, no matter who they love, subscribe to Hart Stories. Because stories like Julian's deserve to be seen, remembered, and carried forward. Charlotte Hayes had boarded without expectation, the way she did most things in her structured life. As the director of public relations for a Fortune 500 firm, she had trained herself to see patterns, the subtle gears of perception, the tiny moments that shape entire reputations. But what unfolded a few rows ahead of her unsettled something older and deeper than her profession. From her seat, she had watched the old man in 14C. He hadn't spoken much, hadn't even shifted when boarding chaos surged around him. His hands rested lightly on his lap as if holding back a tremor, and there had been something in the way he sat upright yet weary that had caught her eye. Then the young flight attendant approached. Words clipped, gestures brisk. Charlotte watched the man's face flicker with confusion, then pain, then nothing at all as he stood, his body stiff and deliberate, each movement forced like a rusted hinge. She felt her chest tighten when he limped away, dragging his dignity down the aisle as quiet judgment rippled through the cabin. Conversations resumed. Treens glowed. A family slid into his vacated row, laughing, arranging snacks. It was as if he had never been there. Charlotte knew what the others saw: a frail passenger inconveniencing the system, but she saw the tremor in his hand as he lowered himself into the cramped middle seat at 32B. She saw the way his shoulders locked, the tension of a body trying not to cry out. And beneath it, something more haunting: the air of someone who had spent a lifetime making himself smaller so others could stay comfortable. She hesitated. This wasn't her business, yet her thumbs moved almost instinctively, opening her phone, composing a message to the airline service department. Years of managing scandals had taught her that injustice often thrived in silence, wrapped in professionalism. She described what she had seen with clinical precision: an elderly man forced from a seat he had booked in advance, moved despite citing a medical injury. She didn't mention the way the world had looked away from him, though the image clung to her mind like smoke. She signed her name, hesitated, then added one last line: "Please escalate. This matters." When she hit send, her screen dimmed to black, reflecting her own unsettled expression. Around her, the cabin's rhythms continued unbroken. The old man sat motionless ahead, shoulders squared, hands still. But Charlotte couldn't unsee the wound stitched invisibly across his posture. Minutes later, her phone vibrated against her thigh. A reply glowed on the screen: "Escalating to command level now." Charlotte stared at the words, a shiver cutting through her practiced composure. She had triggered something, a hidden current moving upward through the chain of authority, awakening quietly beyond the cabin walls. No one else seemed to notice. No one saw how the man in 32B clenched his jaw against the pane as the aircraft taxied, or how he kept his eyes fixed forward like a soldier enduring a drill. Charlotte did not know his name, but she knew the shape of moments like this, the ones that could vanish without witness, leaving no trace except in the quiet conscience of whoever had watched. She thought about how easily dignity could be stripped away when people assumed no one was paying attention, about how many lives had been bent or broken under the weight of collective indifference. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt something pierce through her professional detachment, a sharp human certainty that what she had just done mattered, even if no one would ever know. Because sometimes the difference between erasure and remembrance was just one person refusing to look away. The cabin had settled into that fragile stillness before departure, a suspended hush where every sound seemed sharper. Overhead bins clicked shut, seatbelts snapped into place, and the air carried that sterile tang of climate control and tension. Julian Hart remained at 32B, wedged between two indifferent strangers, his frame drawn inward like someone bracing for impact. The leg he had once trusted to carry him through artillery fire now throbbed under the cramped seat pitch. A relentless pulse he tried to quiet with sheer will. He stared at the back of the seat ahead, as if staring hard enough could keep him from unraveling. Then the cockpit door opened. The sound sliced through the cabin's rhythm like a rifle bolt. A figure emerged, tall, shoulders squared, the stripes on his epaulets catching the overhead light. Captain David Miller did not glance at the cabin crew or the manifest clutched in the purser's hands. He adjusted the brim of his cap, the gesture crisp and exact, and walked down the aisle with the poise of someone who had spent years walking toward danger while others ran away. Passengers turned as he passed, confusion spreading like ripples in water. He did not slow until he stood at row 32, and then he stopped. Julian did not look up at first. He was too accustomed to being unseen, but something in the silence around him shifted, a subtle withdrawal of breath. He raised his head. Captain Miller stood at attention. His jaw was set, eyes steady, and in that stillness was the weight of shared understanding only those who had worn uniforms could recognize. The captain's hand rose, fingers pressed to his brow in a sharp salute. "Staff Sergeant Julian Hart," his voice carried clear, steady, ringing against the metal cabin walls. "On behalf of this airline, and as a fellow soldier, I apologize." No one spoke. The engines idled low beneath the floor, a distant growl under the sudden stillness. Captain Miller lowered his hand, then turned to the flight attendant who had displaced him. Kayla's posture stiffened under his gaze. "Escort him to seat 1A, the captain said. "If no one will offer their place, I will give him mine." Charlotte Hayes, watching from rows ahead, felt her chest constrict. She had spent her career sculpting public gestures. But this was something rawer, not performance, but reckoning. Julian rose slowly. The motion was awkward, halting, every joint stiff with pain and years. But he stood taller than he had when he first boarded, taller even than his frame allowed. The man who had been invisible minutes ago now drew every gaze like gravity. As he made his way up the aisle, the atmosphere changed. Heads turned, phones lowered. People who had earlier stared through him now shifted upright, eyes following. A man in business class pressed a palm to his chest in silent salute. A woman dabbed at her cheek as though wiping away dust. Julian walked past it all, not hurried, not proud, only steady. The pain remained, anchored deep in the shattered knee, but something lighter had risen above it, not vindication, just the unfamiliar warmth of being seen. When he reached the forward cabin, Kayla wordlessly opened the curtain to first class. He lowered himself into 1A as if easing into unknown territory. The seat cradled his frame, generous space around his wounded leg at last. Yet it was the recognition that felt most unreal, like sunlight spilling into a room long sealed. Captain Miller returned to the cockpit without looking back. His steps were measured, purposeful, as if placing a cornerstone where something had been broken. Moments like this were not part of flight protocol. They didn't appear in manuals or policy binders, but they were what kept duty human, the choice to stop the machinery of routine long enough to repair the quiet harm it could inflict. As the door to the cockpit closed behind him, the cabin seemed to exhale as one. The engines surged, the floor trembling with restrained force, and Julian stared out the window. Not at the runway lights, but at the faint reflection of his own face, older, lined, and finally, for once, unhidden. Respect does not begin with titles or uniforms. It begins the moment someone dares to interrupt the rhythm of indifference and say, "This person matters." The hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft lifted from the tarmac, the city lights falling away like dim embers scattered across a dark ocean. In the cocoon of first class, Julian Hart sat motionless, the cool leather pressing gently against his shoulders. His legs stretched forward at last, freed from the painful clamp of the earlier seat. The tension that had cinched his spine since boarding began to loosen. Yet his body remained taut, as if afraid to trust comfort. It had been so long since the world gave him space without demanding he justify his place in it. He had expected silence after the captain's salute, the kind that closes over a moment until it is forgotten. But silence did not come. It lingered at the edges of the cabin, fragile and expectant, like the charged stillness before the first note of a hymn. Somewhere behind him, a seatbelt clicked. Footsteps rose from the back of the plane, hesitant, uneven then steadied with purpose. A figure emerged from the narrow aisle, stopping a few feet away from Julian's seat. Staff Sergeant Hart. The voice broke on the second word. Julian turned. A man stood there in a faded hoodie, posture trembling yet firm, eyes wet and blazing. The cabin lights carved deep hollows into his face, but the emotion in it was unmistakable. "I'm Corporal Reeves," he said. Louder now, though his voice quavered. "Camp Leatherneck. 2006. You pulled me off a minefield. I'm still alive. Because of you." A stunned hush fell over the cabin. Conversations died mid-syllable. Seatback screens flickered soundlessly as if holding their breath. Reeves's words hung in the air like a flare suspended in darkness. Julian's hands, resting on the armrests, tightened. His gaze held steady on the younger man, though something shifted deep behind his eyes, not pride, not even surprise, but a quiet recognition, as if two lives had just folded back into alignment. Before anyone could speak, the intercom chimed. Captain David Miller's voice filled the cabin, steady yet threaded with something raw. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this aircraft will not continue under the shadow of what just happened. This man did not ask for special treatment. He asked only to keep the seat that protected his war-torn leg from locking into pain. And we failed him. But in this profession, and in the one he once served, we do not abandon our own. Not on the battlefield, not 30,000 feet above the earth. Silence answered him at first, deeper than any applause. Then someone clapped sharp, solitary. Another joined, then another. The sound grew, rolling forward from the economy cabin like surf rising to break. Passengers stood in their rows, palms striking together in rhythm, faces turned toward Julian. Kayla, the young flight attendant who had moved him, stood near the galley with tears cutting tracks down her cheeks. Even Reeves remained frozen in the aisle, head bowed as if at a memorial. Julian did not rise. He could not. He only inclined his head once, deeply, the way soldiers acknowledge each other when words would be too small. The applause swelled until it seemed to fill the pressurized air itself, rattling the overhead bins, spilling into every corner of the aircraft. It was not loud like stadium cheers, but resonant, a sound weighted with apology, reverence, and something older than either. Eventually it faded, fragmenting into a hush more powerful than its roar. Passengers returned to their seats, dabbing eyes, clearing throats. The engines droned on, a constant beneath the human tremor. Julian turned back to the window. The clouds blurred by in moonlight, soft and endless. His reflection stared back at him, aged, lined, yet luminous with something he could not name. He had carried silence for decades, the kind pressed onto men who came home with medals yet were told to bury their truth. Tonight, for the first time, that silence cracked. Recognition, he realized, was not about grandeur. It was about being allowed to exist fully, scars, solitude, love, and all without being asked to shrink. And perhaps the most radical act of honor was not to decorate someone after they were gone, but to see them while they were still here. The wheels struck the runway with a muted jolt, and the applause from earlier seemed to dissolve into the soft clatter of cabin activity, seatbelts clicking open, overhead bins unlatched, passengers rising in impatient waves. But Julian Hart stayed seated, waiting as the aisles clogged, hands folded over the cane resting against his thigh. The salute, the applause, even the recognition from Corporal Reeves still shimmered around him like heat, fragile and fleeting. He did not chase it. He had learned long ago that honor was not something to grasp. It was something to quietly endure. When the cabin emptied, he rose with slow care, letting the leg uncoil from where it had been braced. He felt each step down the jet bridge as a muted throb, familiar and grounding. Outside the terminal windows, morning light had begun to seep across Annapolis, pale gold on steel and glass. In the baggage claim hall, a sudden movement caught his eye. A figure in navy blue surged through the crowd with the force of a wave breaking free. Uncle Julian Midshipman Eli Hart collided into him with the unrestrained urgency of someone who had been waiting for years. The hug was fierce, arms locking around Julian's shoulders, uniform creasing against the worn fabric of his blazer. The scent of starch and sea air clung to him. "I saw the video," Eli said, voice muffled into his shoulder. "Everyone at the Academy has, they called it the salute at 32B. Julian said nothing. He only tightened his hold for one breath longer before easing back, studying the young man's face. The same steadfast eyes he remembered from the boy who once refused to leave his side when the world called their family unnatural. That defiance had hardened into something steadier, now purpose-wrapped in quiet composure. They collected the old duffel Julian had carried through decades of stations in silence. As they stepped into the brisk Maryland air, reporters' voices drifted from a distant television in the terminal, murmurs about a viral video, a captain's salute, a story spreading through veteran networks like wildfire. Julian ignored them. He walked beside Eli, listening instead to the rhythm of his nephew's stride, firm and sure. A week later, an envelope slid across the long oak table in the Naval Academy's policy wing. It bore Eli's signature and a single statement of intent, a formal request to transfer his track from naval engineering to Veterans Affairs policy. In his written petition to the board, Eli had closed with a line that would ripple far beyond those walls. because of a man who fought to live truthfully and still saved the lives of those who once turned away from him. Charlotte Hayes read those words weeks later when the Academy published them alongside Eli's acceptance. She had posted her own account the day of the flight, not expecting it to leave her circle. Now it lived across thousands of screens, shared in veterans forums, LGBTQ advocacy groups, and classrooms. The photo of Captain Miller saluting Julian at 32B had become a symbol and image teachers used when they spoke about integrity, when they wanted young cadets to understand that honor does not demand conformity, only courage. Julian never spoke publicly about it. He tended his small garden in Wyoming, answered Eli's calls, and returned to the quiet life he had carried with unwavering discipline. But something subtle had shifted in the air around him. Strangers at the post office nodded. A local history teacher asked if his students could write in letters. And Eli came home more often, now with folders of draft legislation tucked under his arm, asking questions about how to make the system better. Julian would listen, smile faintly, and say, "Just make sure they're seen." He no longer needed more medals. He had been given something rare, proof that a single act of dignity could outlast the noise of dismissal, that the quiet stand of one man could become the path for those who followed. If you were on that plane, would you have stayed silent or stood up for Julian? Tell us in the comments. And if you believe that honor knows no boundaries, not even who we love. Subscribe to Heart Stories to keep these stories alive.